Welcome to the New Books Network.
Welcome to Madison's Notes, the official podcast of the James Madison Program in American Ideals and Institutions. I'm your host, Laura Laurent, and this week we have the privilege of speaking with Dr. Jay Richards, an author, scholar, and an expert in economics and technology. He is the director of the DeVos Center and William E. Simon Senior Research Fellow at the Heritage Foundation, a senior fellow at the Discovery Institute, and editor-at-large of The Stream. Dr. Richards is the author of The Human Advantage, The Future of American Work in an Age of Smart Machines, which was published in 2018, a book that dives deep into the evolving landscape of work, technology, and what it means to be human in the face of rapid advancement in AI and automation. He has a background that spans economics, theology, and public policy, so Dr. Richards brings a unique perspective to the discussion of how we can not only survive, but also thrive in this new era. Today, we're going to dive into some pressing questions like how can we harness our uniquely human traits in a world where machines are getting smarter? Are the ideas he presented in The Human Advantage still relevant in today's fast-paced, ever-changing economic environment as we are 6 years out from its original publication date? And what does the future hold for human work as we continue to integrate advanced technologies into our lives? So, join us for a conversation that will challenge the way you think about work, technology, and the human spirit. Dr. Jay Richards, thank you so much for coming onto this show today.
Oh, it's great to be with you. My pleasure.
Yeah. So I wanted to bring you onto the show today to talk about your book, The Human Advantage, The Future of American Work in an Age of Smart Machines.
hmm
And it came out in 2018. I was a college student at the time. I was studying technology, but I was very interested in philosophy, and I just remember this title coming out. So now that I'm the host of Madison's Notes, I wanted to get to talk to the author himself about it, especially as we've seen technology change and grow so quickly in the last few years. So, well, first of all, for our listeners, can you give me a little bit of background about your particular interest in writing a book about human work in the age of technology? What was the need that you saw this book fulfilling?
I hate to say it, but a lot of the stuff I write is out of frustration. I won't say spite. I'll say frustration. So frustration that, from my perspective, a lot of people are confused about something that they shouldn't be confused about, and so I've had a couple of different kind of career trajectories. I'm basically a philosopher and a shameless generalist that is a parasite on all the other disciplines. So, but I have written for a long time on the intersection of ethics, economics, and technology. In fact, now I hate to say it, almost 20 years ago, I did an edited collection with my friend George Gilder and Ray Kurzweil, a debate about transhumanism. Kurzweil's sort of leader on the transhumanist techno-optimist side of things. And so I've always been interested in these sorts of questions, probably because technology, especially information technology, it's like all the really interesting philosophical questions and questions about the nature of the human person actually intersect with this. And so this, really, I guess this trajectory that led to the Human Advantage started with my book, Money, Greed, and God, which is essentially an attempt to say, okay, here's the stuff that we understand and know about economics and shouldn't be confused about, and here's why you can believe these things and be a faithful Christian. That was actually what the book was about, and it has ended up being used to accompany econ textbooks and intro econ courses, which is gratifying. But there are a bunch of other things like that. And I never really dealt with this question of automation and artificial intelligence and robotics. And, in some ways, I wish I had written this book for 2024 because all of a sudden, with the large language models and the chatbots, everybody's talking about this stuff. I was anticipating it in, say around 2015 because books were coming out, including one called The Rise of the Robots, that were claiming, okay, total automation is right around the corner. It's going to replace us all and we're not going to have anything to do. So either we're going to be depressed or it's going to be awesome because the government can just give us a basic income and the robots will do all these things. And I thought, one, that's not true. There's no reason to think that's true on both economic and philosophical grounds. But also the question is, what do we do? What kind of advice would I give someone that is, say, in college, like you were at the time, that's preparing for what is obviously going to be a great deal of disruption as a result of this advanced information technology. So the book is in some ways both an attempt to debunk myths that cause people to, I think, project false pictures into the future, but also kind of a book of advice. Okay, how do you optimize yourself in an age of smart machines and robots that can do a lot of stuff that, maybe until a few years ago we thought only humans could. So that's the kind of the genealogy of how uh, the book landed when it did. And I laugh now because at the time it was actually the skeptics that thought it would take years to get full automation with cars. And so here we are 5 years later, it still hadn't quite happened. So that's always one of the lessons with sort of tech projections is that um, very often you have to separate, okay, what's likely to happen from what the entrepreneurs that want you to invest in their company are telling you is going to happen.
Yeah, there's always a balance of listening to the people who are looking for some money from you
Mhm. Yes.
about what they're building, and it's true that we've gotten some really interesting things changed in the last few years around automation, and I'm curious, what specific arguments might you change or adjust verbiage on,
Mm.
knowing the technologies that we have today versus when you were writing the book in 2018?
Well, I would definitely talk more about large language models than I did. It it honestly the kind of emergence of these, and so Chat GPT-4, Grok now on X or Claude, which I like, are staggering to people that aren't sort of following these things. Even though Gary Wolfram wrote a nice little book last year on kind of what's really happening with Chat GPT, and he explains this is really kind of mundane things, these kind of sorting algorithms, and you've got lots of parameters, and it kind of runs these complex statistics with a bunch of data that they train it on, some segment of the internet. And so, in a sense, it's not mysterious. There's no one thinks these are sort of intelligent things, and yet they produce these kinds of remarkable results. And in some ways, this confirms an argument that I think is underappreciated, but that I really emphasized in the book, which is that um, information technology is going to do a bunch of stuff that we think of as intellectual. So if you think of humans as that kind of thing that sets it apart as, I don't know, reason or something, this can be counterintuitive that it would do things that we think of that are intellectual. And then it has a hard time doing stuff that we think of as trivial and menial labor, like a housekeeper or something like that. But that's just the reality of the situation is that there's these kind of complex dynamics involved in moving in three-dimensional space with your body that are really, really hard to capture. So there's a bunch of skilled trades that aren't going anywhere anytime soon. And then there's some really smart jobs that are going to get automated. And this is a perfect example. We have these large language models that now will do probably 95% of what book translators were doing a couple of years ago, in which you have to translate from English to the French or something like that. Those jobs, as they were, are going to go away because everyone will use these, use these things as translation tools, and then they'll edit it after the fact. On the other hand, I don't see any Rosie the robots like the Jetsons had anywhere. It's not anywhere on the horizon. Nobody's predicting it, and I don't think it's going to happen anytime soon. That, if anything, I want to emphasize, it's sort of re-emphasize that. And then the other thing about the book is when I was looking back through it this morning, is that I was trying to offer an optimistic take because there was so much pessimism at the time. Um, but, you do have to sort of speak to the moment, and so I almost feel like optimism people don't really like that. They didn't wanna hear what they could do to still have a decent life. They wanted to hear about how evil the robots were, and that was kind of it. And so I wonder if I would have sort of framed it differently if I were writing it today. I probably would have. I'd have made it a slightly darker book, perhaps.
Something to keep us on our toes
Mhm.
a little bit more than saying, "Well, we'll just be fine."
Yes, exactly.
Yeah. Well, and this might be an obvious question to you, but I think it's important for us to set a basis in this
Mhm,
conversation. For you, you mentioned in the book a number of things that make humans distinctly human and
mhm.
not simply smart machines with
Yeah.
3D capabilities of maneuverability. Can you say a little bit more about some of the pinnacles of humanness that, in your view, machines will not be able to meet us in?
Yeah, I mean, I mean, the big one is I don't think that the machines are going to ever become conscious agents. So this is a philosophical dispute, but in in the whole kind of technology, robotics, transhumanist literature, there is this philosophical dispute between what's called weak AI and strong AI. So weak AI is actually the stuff that we encounter when you do a Google search. You're encountering this. It does something like intelligence, like it helps you find something that you were looking for. Of course, the system is designed by intelligent people, so it's not like it's sort of doing this on its own. But strong AI, the basic idea is either that we will develop machines uh, that have kind of general intelligence, which implies consciousness and agency, like we have, um, and and at that point, essentially, the machines will fully supplant us because they will have and do everything that we have. I just think, okay, there are really good reasons to think that's just not true. There are no good philosophical arguments for this. In fact, the only reason to think this is if you're already a materialist who thinks, well, we're just machines made of meat, so why won't we be able to make machines out of other things that can do the same thing? And so that's, I think, what's happening. The strong AI enthusiasm is almost entirely kind of bad metaphysics masquerading as technology and economics. And if you have good reason to think, okay, look, I'm sure, first of all, we're not machines. Secondly, there's nothing we're doing with computers and robots that's going to become conscious agents. Then you can kind of set that problem to the side. And that's also a prediction, right? I'm predicting that's not going to happen. And so every year it doesn't happen is a confirmation of the prediction. But then it also kind of gives you an idea of, okay, so what would we focus on if we were going to say what distinguishes intrinsically humans from machines? It's going to be those things. It's going to be those things that attach to the fact that we are agents, that we can choose, that we can act for purposes, we can develop virtues and vices. Think about a virtue as us literally consciously, willfully acting first at a kind of low level and then a higher level until we, in some ways, kind of rewire ourselves so that what was hard before and as a strong act of the will becomes a kind of automated habit and part of who we are. That is a kind of it's a uniquely human thing, and it involves freedom and will and consciousness and purpose. And so those are the kinds of things that we need to look at, if we're going to say, okay, in economic terms, what would be our long-term comparative advantage over the machines we make? It's going to be those human advantages, which I do consider to be advantages. So I don't think there's anything different in kind from the information technology revolution than from previous ones. It's just that it happens much more quickly and it seems to touch more closely at what the human person is. But I think if anything, it should help us clarify what distinguishes humans from machines.
Mm, quite. Well, and I'm curious, this might be a bit pedantic, but
Mhm.
as you were speaking about virtues and that we're able to willfully choose different habits and form
Yeah.
habits, how is that different from an algorithm optimizing itself?
Yeah. Well, it's there's no will there, right? So there's no resistance. It's built in, and so of course, training programs like Tesla is doing. I mean, this is how we've gotten really good technologies here in the last few years is machine learning, as opposed to literally programming things in. You're never getting a self-driving car if that's what you have to do. What you want is a bunch of cars with a bunch of sensors riding around and recording the data, and then now, initially, people are driving those cars because it's recording all the data of what the conscious drivers do, but it eventually kind of detects these underlying patterns, and so that it could sort of program, right? And so once you have one self-driving car that's used all this machine learning, um, that's what you will use for all the other self-driving cars, and so that's why I think, in principle, self-driving cars are probably going to happen. I think that getting 98% of the way there is going to be as easy as getting to 99%. Though, as you get closer and closer to full automation, it's going to be difficult. But the truth of the matter is, I mean, a self-driving car doesn't have to be perfect. It just has to be better than the average driver. That's kind of a low barrier, right? And so it's really going to have to be a lot more than that because we'll be distrustful of self-driving cars. But those are the kinds of things that I think are automatable. And so that's kind of one of the rules that I say, which is treated as an axiom in the book, everything that can be automated will be automated. And so if it can actually be sort of done in this way, it almost certainly will. And that in some ways that can sound scary, but it also helps focus because then you say, okay, if I'm going to sort of focus on long-term prospects, I want to focus not on those things that are likely to get replaced or disrupted.
Mm. No, I think that's a good way to look at the focusing as a future mindset as opposed to the doom and gloom of, oh, but I got this degree in this thing that is not going to exist in human functioning in 5 years. So I'm curious on the topic of meaningful work. As things are getting automated, people might have chosen their entire careers and their paths to something that they thought was very meaningful and is now going to be going away. What, in your perspective and with these views of technology, is meaningful work?
I would say the central feature of work being meaningful is whether you're creating value for yourself and others or not. It's not, is this repetitive? It's not, I mean, people often say that. Yeah, I hear people say, well, who wants, somebody, how horrible it would be to have to work in a factory doing the same thing over and over. To which I say, so do you think that a priest hearing confession is that's not dignified work, right? I mean, that's crazy because I mean, the truth of the matter is there could be something that or as long as you're creating value and understand what you're doing is actually creating value. I actually think that's the thing. We know from happiness studies that people that are in jobs, it might be building septic tanks or cleaning septic tanks. It might be financial advising. It might be being a pediatrician. The thing that makes people happy generally is if they perceive themselves to be creating value and then to be being rewarded for it. So what Arthur Brooks calls earned success. So it's a type of success that you've earned. You've earned it, in other words, because there's some kind of value that you have created for others. I think that's the key thing. That's what everybody actually, they don't necessarily say it that way, but that's what they're looking for. And I think listeners could think probably in their own lives, most of us have had jobs where we felt like, oh gosh, I'm not really creating value here. I'm getting paid, but it kind of it wears on you. And so I think that's sort of the crucial thing. And I think people are worried ultimately that well, either they won't get to have a job like that, or there won't be any jobs left. Which I actually think that's actually the greater dystopia to me. I think some people say, hey, it'll be awesome when the robots do everything. We won't have to work. There is no evidence that that leads to flourishing and to happiness. It's, I mean, if you want to see how that looks, the best version of that is in the film, the Pixar film Wall-E, where the humans go up in these ships and they're just riding around on these floating chase lounges, right? That's a depressing prospect. I mean, God created us and commanded us to be fruitful and multiply, to fill the earth and subdue it. And if we're not doing that in some way, I think the reality is that fully we're not fully working out what it means to be made in the image of God, and so we're just not going to flourish.
And I'm curious because we have different cultural understandings of meaningful work. What
Mhm.
does it mean that often work that might be considered gratifying or morally guided is not always what the economic system recognizes as valuable in terms of monetary provision?
Well, I mean, this is the difficulty. If you're going to have an economy in which you don't just specify ahead of time what people are allowed to have and what they're allowed to sort of like or prefer, then what's going to happen is that things that the people that produce things that people value, right, are going to make more money than things that get produced that people don't value. And so that leads, I mean, the obvious example would be professional sports, for instance, right? In which you get somebody that's really, really good at professional sports. They make tens of millions of dollars. You think, okay, that's it's nice, I guess. But what about this teacher that's teaching poor children in an inner city school? Surely that's sort of more valuable. Um, I don't quite know how to sort of answer that, except that there's no sort of obvious way to set things up so that it would be at all different. The reason that the professional athlete is getting paid is partly because he actually has a skill that's extremely scarce, and that also people value. Whereas I hate to say it, but sorry, being a kindergarten teacher is if you're moderately intelligent and are able to work with people, lots of people could do that. And so that tends to be how those things are. But I can say that more of the things you think ought to be done and be remunerated are going to be done and remunerated better in a society that has free prices. In other words, in which prices are free to range based upon people's subjective preferences. Now, what people subjectively prefer is itself a question of virtue and vice. And so it doesn't mean that sort of market's morally neutral, because the truth of the matter is, if people are virtuous, they're going to want things that are different from when people are vicious. And so there's a constant interplay between what happens in a market and what's happening in the culture. And it doesn't mean that because a market works really well to exchange goods and services and information, that we have to let everything be traded and sold, whether it be body parts or children or labor or sex or any of those kinds of things. Um, and so the question of political economy is always going to be, okay, how to kind of strike that balance, right? In which you have an economy that's good at doing the things it's supposed to do, but we don't hand everything over to the market or to the economy. There's also the state, there's civil society, there's the things that are virtue forming. All those things have to be working, I think, properly for the whole system.
Hmm. I'm curious, when we speak about human creativity and innovation specifically,
Hmm.
how has digitization changed our understanding of what it means to create in a physical versus digital sense? In
Yeah.
that the things I can sit down at my corporate job and be creating things
Hmm.
all day, but they're digital products, it's Excel spreadsheets, it's PowerPoints, as opposed to having something of physical value that I produced.
Well, the kind of key difference between, let's just say, say agrarian and industrial economies and information economies, is this digitization that you referred to. And so that's, in fact, in the book, I describe these kind of key features of an information economy and then the virtues that would correspond to those if you're sort of trying to optimize your virtues for this economy. Well, digitization, what that means is this is the idea of shifting from the world of atoms and molecules to the world of bits, right? And so we're into the realm of information. And what is significant about that is that you end up creating more and more goods and services that are what economists call non-rival. So a non-rival good is just a good in which, or a service in which I can have it and it doesn't deplete the store of those things. So if I download a tune on iTunes, which nobody does anymore, right? But let's say I listen to it on Spotify, I'm streaming it. That doesn't deprive you somewhere else in the country from listening to the exact same song. Unlike, say, bananas or cars or houses, those are rival goods because if I own and occupy a house exclusively, then that means nobody else can own and occupy it exclusively. And so that's a remarkable thing because what it means is that you end up with these weird kinds of abundances in which, because these goods are non-rival, you can end up moving toward what's called zero marginal cost. So, in other words, economists talk about the marginal cost is like the cost of the next unit of something. And so you've got a factory. And once you have a big, really, really efficient factory, each additional unit, once that thing is set up, is going to be fairly inexpensive to produce. But if you're printing books or something, no matter how automated it is, it's still going to be there's going to be a cost involved because of the paper and the printing and the storage. Well, once you have the kind of infrastructure in place for digital goods, um, they are virtually zero cost. So because they're bits, right? Because they're information. The infrastructure is expensive, obviously, but the goods themselves are weirdly abundant. And so, if you thought of economics as just the study of allocation of resources given scarcity, that's sort of weird when you get the kind of strange abundance. And so, I mean, what we're doing right now, right? We're not using up recording tape or magnetic tape. All of this sounds that we're making right now are getting converted into digital entities, right? And so that's amazing in some ways, but it also, if we're not careful, it can trick us into thinking that, well, being embodied and being made of molecules, right, is sort of not important. You ultimately can't get away from the world of atoms and molecules and bodies because that's where we live. And so there's both this kind of promise of a weird kind of abundance in the digital economy, but there's also this danger in which people, sort of become dissociated from themselves. This is like any technology, these technologies, they have both promise and peril, and I think we're gonna have to face both of those
Mm. Yeah, and I think it's easy to see that technology as powerful tools that we might employ. With it, they also have a number of downsides.
things.
Do you believe that we have some kind of moral obligation to limit technological progress if it's threatening what we believe to be intrinsically human, like empathy or this attunement to oneself?
Well, it's always the devil's in the details, right? So people will say, okay, well, how do you decide if a regulation is good or bad? And I say, well, do the benefits exceed the costs, right? In all sorts of ways. And so, so for instance, it's like, should we limit the development of these large language models? Well, what would that mean exactly? Well, basically, what that would mean is we would limit American companies from doing it, which means we're leaving it to the Russians and the Chinese and the Iranians to do it, which sounds really, really stupid. And so that's always going to be the kind of question with these technologies. It's like Pandora's box doesn't get, you don't get the stuff back in the box. And so, in some ways, once the technology is available and the knowledge for developing these things is available, I think spending our time, okay, how do we sort of stop it? Is in some ways it's probably futile and counterproductive because our ability to actually do it's quite limited and probably has very negative consequences. I think that with respect to say these chat bots, there's large language models. Probably the best thing is to make sure that there's genuine competition between them, because my worry is that we end up with a kind of a federal regulatory agency plus a giant multinational corporation in collusion to control it and to sort of squeeze out the competition. I think that's the kind of thing that I'm going to I spend my time worrying about. I'm glad that at the moment we're in this stage where there's at least genuine competition.
So, if it's not something that we want to regulate systematically, insofar as it helps us maintain different levels of political or economic or international power, in your view, what is the way to address these downsides for individuals or people who, like children, who don't have the skill set or the quote
Mhm.
unquote virtues to manage the downsides of using certain types of technology?
I mean, think about it in terms of farm equipment, right? So I grew up in the panhandle of Texas, and there are these giant combines and tractors, these enormous machines that one person could drive. No one put their 4-year-old in the driver's seat of a combine, right? You don't do that. You don't put kids in a factory floor, right? You don't let them work with the mechanic in the garage, lifting cars up and down. We need to think about these technologies in the same way. Why the heck, before your kids even know how to read and interact with people in a normal way, are we allowing them uh, uh, access to these things that they're not adapted for? Look, we're trying to figure out how to adapt to them as adults. And so I really think, while on the one hand, I think that this idea that we're going to sort of control these in any sort of macro way is unrealistic. We have responsibility with our children to honestly, to protect them from these things. I think children should be exposed to digital technology and screens very, very slowly and not immediately. And honestly, that's one of the things that I'm really, really worried about. Don't spend, I don't lose a moment's sleep thinking the robots are literally going to replace us. I do worry about children's brains who are exposed to these honestly the kind of networking technologies long before they've developed the kind of rudimentary things that they actually need to work in the world.
Hmm. Hmm. Yeah, I've even noticed in myself and my experiences interacting with the world that we've started to lose connections with certain types of vocabulary. There's jargon in any industry you go into, but I was specifically in consulting, and I was working with a lot of people, they'd always say the 30,000-foot view. I was like, when has the partner at the consulting firm sat at a window seat in a plane and looked out and not been on their laptop working the whole time?
Yeah, you close the window because the light is reflecting onto your screen. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. So, I think similarly, there's a danger of losing our touch points with a number of things. So, I'm curious, have there been any technological advancements that made you rethink any of your positions or adjust the way you were presenting them?
You know, the thing that I continue to be frustrated about, honestly, I probably did not talk enough about online pornography. The thing that I focused on in the book is sex robots, because it really getting creepy, right? And it sort of combines the problems of porn with robotics. It's in some ways, if you think of porn as okay, it comes at you visually and maybe auditorially. With sex robots, right? You're actually acting out in your body these things, right? And so it's going to shape people in a much more profound way, even than online pornography. And so that I really worry about. Figuring out exactly how to control it is the difficult question. And I think this is sort of, we're at the experiment stage. I think the moral principle we recognize is that children should be protected from things like this. Almost everyone intuitively knows you don't sexualize children. You don't expose them. Everyone, right? You can have the roughest Marine in the world that's been out, on the front for several years, and he shows up and there's some little kids. He's going to know he probably shouldn't use the F word, right? He's just going to know that. And so that's the kind of moral intuition. And so how exactly do we protect kids from these things that are almost ubiquitous? I'm convinced there is a technological way to do this. I'd say at the moment the best experiments are these age verification laws, like the ones that I think passed in Louisiana and Texas. Look, there's a trade-off here between sort of privacy and protection. But sorry, your Facebook already knows everything about you anyway. And if you really want to view porn, verifying your age with your driver's license, your credit card, that just seems like that's okay. That's just going to be a cost for you to get to do that. And the great thing is, just passing these age verification laws makes the porn companies so mad that in the case of Pornhub, they sort of shut off access to the state. Well, gosh, that ends up seems like it's a lot easier than I would have imagined it would have been. And so I really think we have to take seriously. Porn is the kind of obvious case of toxicity, um, but we have to find ways of being able to protect kids from these things because it's just absolutely staggering and something that I consider it a serious public health crisis that we've got to find a way to solve.
Mm. Yeah, I'm curious, something you said there about Facebook knowing everything about you, and I think there's
Mhm.
this growing understanding. There's surveillance technologies are being further implemented across public spaces and private spaces, et cetera. How do we reconcile the notion of free will with an increasing predictability of human behavior through
Mm.
all of this pattern recognition and certain increase in surveillance?
Well, in some ways, I think it requires us to refine what we understand free will to be. So, what is the kind of core intuition of what philosophers call kind of libertarian freedom? Which doesn't mean Mises and Hayek. It's just this term, libertarian freedom, which basically means, do you have within yourself the capacity to choose between some alternative? Um, in some cases, that is perfectly compatible with the fact that we are shaped by all sorts of preferences and habits and maybe biological factors in our environment to choose certain things. But if you think free will is this kind of disembodied being that's not shaped by anything, right? To choose, then it can be scary to discover how yeah, how sort of predictable our actions are. But in some ways, the way that we actually sort of preserve our agency when we are preserving our agency is by making more and more things automated. I mean, I want my driving to work to be mostly automated so I'm not conscious of it, so I can listen to the audiobook that I have playing, right? And so I hope that my driving is extremely predictable. That's not I'm not it's not a loss of agency. What I'm doing is I'm automating that in a predictable way so that I can focus on something else. And so I think that's the way you want to think of your freedom. and not imagine it as, okay, I have this kind of unfettered ability to choose between things without being shaped. That's extremely unrealistic. And the better Facebook gets at predicting you, the more obvious this is. Look, I mean, if according to Facebook and Instagram, all I do is look at cute cat videos and workout videos. That is just it. And then Google thinks that I'm just interested in space and science stuff, and what that tells me is, gosh, when I go to these platforms, that must be what all I do.
Mhm, mhm. Well, and I think I find a particular joy in training my social media algorithms to I'm like, "I only want to see X subject," and
Exactly.
yeah, and once you know how to feed the system and you know that's what it's doing, I think the danger is when you don't know that's what it's
That's
doing, and
right.
it's a little bit freakier, but as we learn to adapt with our friends, the machines. So I'm curious, we have a lot of opportunities to outsource
Hmm.
laborious tasks
Yeah.
in or not always laborious tasks, but, tasks that would require a lot of mental focus.
Hmm.
What in your view, what are the choices that are worth making ourselves versus the ones that are worth handing over to machines?
Well, at first it would be, is there a machine that can do it well, obviously, but let's say there is one. Um, and so, I mean, let's make this really acute. So, Watson that I talk about in the book, which was this IBM machine computer that beat the two reigning human champions in Jeopardy way back in like 2011, I think. Now this has been that long. Well, the very next thing they trained Watson on, which is an IBM technology, was diagnosing X-rays, right? And so it seems like if you think about, let's take something like a breast cancer, for instance. So imagine we have a database that has 5 million X-ray images of mammograms, and they are accurately coded so that some are benign, some trigger certain kinds of non-malignant tumors, and some say, we know, okay, these patterns correspond to malignant tumors. You train a pattern recognition system on that. At some point, it gets really good at recognizing instantly, better even than a really well trained diagnostician. That's going to happen. Now, do we want to say, well, I want the bespoke treatment. So even though the machines are 10 times better, nobody's wanting that. It's like nobody wants a handmade advanced microprocessor, right? And so that's what I think. Look, we're just not gonna. Nobody's gonna choose not to use that technology because it obviously does the thing we want, which is to diagnose and distinguish cancer from non-cancer. And so I think those are the kinds of choices we're going to have thousands and thousands and thousands of times, which is why I say it's sort of almost anything that can be automated will be automated. Um, Now, what does that mean, though, exactly? The assumption initially, like in that case, you're going to say you're never going to want the manual labor version of the diagnosis if you can get a machine can do it much better. On the other hand, there's lots of things that we want that are like that. Like some people prefer handmade ties to machine made ties. Some people prefer their really expensive eggs from the local farmer at the farmer's market that they know the name of the chicken. They could get eggs for a tenth of the price at Costco, but they want that. That's what I think is actually already happening. It's that I call that bespoke labor. That what happens is that people actually start preferring different things, and so that will happen simultaneously with the increased automation. We're going to have hydroponically grown, drone tended Boston bib lettuce at Costco, and we're going to have the farmers market from Fred, down down the road, and we'll actually, because of the how inexpensive that drone grown lettuce is, we'll probably spend more time and money and attention on that other stuff.
Mm. So you would say that the current gig economy and the rise of freelancing is in alignment um, with the ideas of meaningful work that you're discussing in your book and continues to be so.
Yeah, I do. I mean, I am a major consumer of rideshare services, and so I always talk to Uber drivers. I ask sort of pull test ideas all the time with them, and almost always Uber drivers are doing something else in addition, or they're doing it because they lost their job and need it like this. If we imagined, okay, well, Uber driving that's the kind of highest aspiration, then okay, no, that would be bad. But it's sort of like saying, well, who wants to earn minimum wage at McDonald's? Well, if you've never had a job and don't know how to show up on time, that's precisely what you should be doing because it trains you to do the things that can help you get a better job. And so I think the rideshare services, they sort of they fill in gaps in the job market and they can create opportunities for people at certain moments. But I don't have any illusions that somehow that's, those are sort of fully glorified and fulfilling careers. I just don't think that's probably how they certainly it's not how they function now. I also think it's somewhat temporary because we're going to get uh, systems, probably automated drive share systems that will start out along dedicated routes in cities and things like that. And so even those jobs, I think, are probably they're absolutely not permanent. I mean, they will just as ride shares displace the monopolies of yellow cabs. I think the rideshare jobs will probably get displaced by some more automated possibilities in the future.
Yeah. Or even what we're seeing now, restructuring of rideshare systems to look like what taxis looked like 50 years
Yes,
ago.
that's right,
Uh,
exactly.
yeah. Yeah. Well, and I'm curious. So we have as as we see technology grow, oftentimes the companies producing these technologies have taken enormous monopolies of
Mhm.
spaces. Do you think that there's still enough space for innovative companies to disrupt and change the landscape of the monopolies, or are the monopolies just so big over the technological space that there's really not a space to disrupt without just getting bought up and gobbled by those monopolies?
Well, I mean, I guess I've been at this long enough. I moved to Seattle just out of graduate school in 1998, so right at the beginning of the first tech bubble, right? And I can remember at the time everyone was talking about Microsoft being this global monopoly. And in fact, they were being sued by the federal government for it. Nobody talks about monopoly anymore. Now we think about Google and Meta. And so in some ways, I think even these very large companies that might seem invincible, what they actually do when they get very large is they actually end up squandering the thing that made them great. I mean, we're seeing Google do this. What made Google great was their search algorithm. I'm old enough, look, I remember the first Google search I did when I was using Ask Jeeves and Alta Vista beforehand was glorious. They now continually degrade what was their primary product by manipulating it for basically ideological and political purposes, right? Now, that's not the sort of thing that a company would do unless they feel like, okay, well, we can sort of afford to do it. But the longer they do that, I think the more likely they are to be disrupted. Um, and the truth of the matter is, I mean, Elon Musk is a perfect example of what could happen. I mean, Musk has managed to just disrupt one after another industry. He's completely upended the rocket industry. He's going to upend, I think, the probably the search algorithm, even the chat bots, and he's completely disrupted the media monopolies. And so when technology companies can have an advantage in that there's this kind of winner take all uh, dynamic, and so a network only gets good when lots of people are involved in it. But then once lots of people are locked into that network, it makes it much more difficult for the upstart. And so everybody thinks of Facebook. They forget that MySpace actually started it. So Facebook actually disrupted MySpace. But it's very hard to fill the same kind of space that Facebook does. On the other hand, there are lots of other kind of social media platforms that all kind of do different things. And so um, my worry for monopolies, the ones that I really worry about are the ones in which you have a kind of collusion of the government with industry. Those are the ones that are very, very hard. We see that in banking. We certainly see that in pharmaceutical companies. It's just unbelievable. I mean, the fact that full-time employees in the National Institutes of Health can also get royalties from drug companies legally. That tells you how incestuous this is. Technology is not like that. Like the technology companies here in DC, they have to send their lobbyists, but the tech companies are not nearly as sort of fused with federal government as some of these other much longer standing industries. what we've seen with the Twitter files is what we've had is attempts by government agencies to just basically control the flow of information by intimidating uh, technological industries. That's the thing that I always worry about. Not that a company gets big because it's good at doing what it does, like Whole Foods or Amazon, but that it gets big and then it stays big and it stays a monopoly by controlling the regulatory agencies or allowing itself to be controlled. I think
Mm,
that's the perennial danger of a monopoly is one in which you get a fusion of government and business.
mm, mm. Okay. Understandable. All right, I wanna start wrapping up a little bit. So, I mean, I've been in a number of jobs where even in quote unquote "creative fields," I'm still just pushing little machine buttons, and it
Hmm.
feels like you're a cog in a machine, and it's one of those jobs that you talked about where you're getting paid, but it doesn't feel as though you're providing value.
Yes.
Um, how might you instruct individuals to touch in with their own humanity even if their work doesn't support that,
Mm,
or and it's monetarily it doesn't make sense for them to, take the pay cut and go work as a carpenter or do
right.
something closer to the ground, but how would you advise us little monkeys in the machine?
Yeah, exactly. Well, it is funny, and in some ways, um, it helps to think about, okay, what were people doing in previous generations? And so imagine if you're 200 years ago and you're in, let's say you're white, okay, and you're European extraction. It's 200 years ago, and you're in one of the American colonies, or now you're in the new United States of America. Um, you're very likely, in fact, 90% of that population a couple hundred years ago were living and working on farms. All right. Um, so they literally didn't have a lot of choices. It was like, well, I can starve, I can work on a farm. That's sort of that's it, right? And if you're a woman, you're not voting. You're probably going to, except for a few places, you're probably going to get higher education. That was how it was for a lot of human history, and in fact, even in the kind of early days of the American frontier. And so that helps. Okay, so how did people sort of fare there? Sometimes your job is the thing that allows you to do the other thing, right? So it may be that you're a man and you're married and you have children, and the job itself of the thing you're doing isn't actually what gives you meaning. It's the fact the job gives you the money that allows you to provide for your children. And so at the bottom, it should be able to at least do that. Because the reality is sometimes like, yeah, I don't really love this, but I am able to provide for my family, and that's what gives you fulfillment. Ideally, though, that should not be a long term situation for anyone, certainly not in the US. Because the truth of the matter is, almost all of us do have lots more choices than most people did for the most of human history. I think if someone's a college student and they ask me, okay, so how do I kind of optimize myself for this? I actually think you want, I mean, I'm a huge advocate of people getting liberal arts degrees if they can afford it or their parents can afford it, in which they're genuinely grounded in the kind of great ideas and the great text, and then also develop some kind of specialty that might or might not pan out. And so it's the joke that you'll learn how to code. Actually, it doesn't hurt to learn how to code. I mean, you can actually you can just do a Google certificate for a few $100 online in about 3 months, and you're actually able to change jobs. I mean, this is actually possible, and that was not possible, anything like that, for most of human history. So in some ways, I think it helps to have a little bit of historical perspective because every moment always you tend to notice the bad things in your present circumstances. But as bad as things are, as bad as inflation is, almost all of us, if you're just at the kind of top of the bell curve on intelligence and have just a little bit of diligence and know how to talk and write a coherent sentence, actually, there's actually probably a lot of things that you can do.
Well, and even if you don't know how to talk and you can't write a coherent sentence, we have the technology that will give us lessons on that. You just ask ChatGPT, "How do I structure a sentence?" and you'll learn real quick.
That's right.
Yeah. So, I'm curious, I love the intersection of literature and music and art and in philosophy and economics.
Mhm. Yeah.
So, I'm curious, are there any pieces of art or literature that accurately showcase and express your view of the relationship between humans and machines, and not necessarily like a sci-fi film, but
Right.
yeah.
Yeah, because the problem is that I must confess I've been thinking dystopian thoughts lately, and so have reread That Hideous Strength actually
Mm,
uh, a couple of times actually in the last year by C.S. Lewis, and so that's sort of the dark kind of manifestation of this. I would honestly have to think about it. I mean, I'm trying to think because almost all the literary treatments of this, I mean, Frankenstein, right? I mean, the mind very quickly you think of it's almost a story about the use of human technology sort of run amok and destroying ourselves. And so, in some ways, it's sort of like um, it's like literature and movies treatment of business people or bankers. I mean, try to think of okay, how many good guys can you think of in a movie or in a novel in which the good guy, qua good guy, was a banker, right? It's a Wonderful Life is the answer. That's kind of the
yeah.
only one, you
Which you
know.
use in your book.
Yes,
Yeah.
exactly. And so it's the same thing. Is that technology, we tend to kind of notice its perils, and that's a kind of an easier treatment. It ends up being things like Star Trek or something, in which, gosh, that's the kind of sort of utopian vision. I don't think that either the utopian or the dystopian vision of these things is that shouldn't shape our kind of present perspective. What I think we should do is say, okay, technology is ultimately an expression of our own capacity as humans made in the image of God. And so it's an expression, a kind of expression of our creativity, and it's kind of a prosthesis of the mind. And because of that, it enhances our power. And because we are fallen, it enhances our power, right? And so it can be used and will be used for good and for ill. And so, in some ways, I don't think technological development is inevitable, but I do think that there are trends that are actually really, really hard to stop. And so, what we want to do is always try to be one step ahead and anticipating okay, what are going to be the perils of this amazing new technology that we're all excited about, and try to anticipate that ahead of time, which really does require understanding the nature of the technology that you're talking about.
Mm, mm. Thank you so much. Well, I'm really grateful that you were willing to come in and have a chat with us. And even though the book came out in 2018, it's still really pertinent and I think important for us to reflect on some of these things moving forward as the future is forever unknowable. So
Yes, indeed. Great to be with you.
thanks for tuning in on today's episode of Madison's Notes. I hope you enjoyed this conversation, and I'm curious what you think about what Dr. Richards has to say on human work in the age of smart machines. So why don't you let me know in the comments, and while you're there, feel free to like and subscribe on all major podcast platforms. I'm Laura Laurent, and this has been Madison's Notes.